good evening, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, where we unwind with the stories of remarkable lives, allowing the noise of the day to slowly fade away. Tonight, we explore the life of a man whose name still echoes through history, not because he ruled the longest, or because he conquered the most land, but because he revealed something unsettling about power itself. Napoleon Bonaparte is often remembered as a general, sometimes as an emperor, occasionally as a tyrant, but those labels explain very little. Napoleon did not inherit a throne. He did not claim divine right. He did not rise from ancient lineage or sacred tradition. He rose through competence, and that may be the most dangerous way power has ever risen. At the end of the 18th century, France was exhausted by kings who ruled by birth, exhausted by revolutions that promised freedom and delivered chaos, exhausted by ideas that sounded noble but failed to hold society together once the shouting stopped. The Enlightenment had promised something new. That reason could replace superstition, that law could replace bloodline, that systems could replace the arbitrary rule of individuals. And yet, reason alone could not prevent collapse. It could not stop governments from rising and falling in rapid succession. It could not turn ideals into stability. This was the moment Napoleon stepped into history. He did not arrive preaching a philosophy. He arrived offering order. He spoke the language of efficiency, merit, and structure. He promised to preserve the revolution while quietly disciplining it. He claimed to protect equality even as he concentrated authority in his own hands. To many, he felt like relief. Napoleon did not rule by myth. He ruled by administration. Under his command, Europe was reorganized. Legal codes were standardized. Institutions were centralized. Borders were redrawn not by tradition but by calculation. Liberty traveled with armies. Equality marched alongside artillery. And fraternity learned to obey orders. To his enemies, he was a tyrant in modern disguise. But to history, he became something far more revealing. He showed that modern power does not need to claim it comes from God. It only needs to present itself as necessary for stability, necessary for order, and once accepted, almost impossible to reverse. This is not a story about battles, though there will be many. It is not a story about ambition, though Napoleon possessed it in abundance. It is a story about what happens when ideals are transformed into systems, and when systems discover they function best under a single will. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor, he did not reject the Enlightenment. He completed it. And when his empire eventually collapsed, the structures he built did not vanish with him. The laws remained. The institutions endured. The modern state continued to function long after the man was gone. Napoleon failed as a ruler, but the model of power he perfected did not. And this is why Napoleon still matters in a world that trusts systems more than people. So tonight, as the world grows quieter, we'll trace how a young outsider from Corsica became the first truly modern ruler, and why his story still lingers wherever efficiency is mistaken for virtue and order is confused with justice. So settle in now. Let the day loosen its grip and allow this story to unfold at its own pace. This is the bedtime biography of Napoleon Bonaparte. Before we continue, take a quiet moment. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are and what time it is for you as this story reaches you. Some people listen late at night. Others while working, traveling, or trying to slow their thoughts. There's no right moment for a story like this, only the one you happen to be in. And if this kind of long-form history helps you stay with the night, consider subscribing so you can find your way back again. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The story begins far from Paris, far from assemblies, crowds, and revolutionary slogans. It begins on the island of Corsica. When Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769, Corsica had only recently become French. The transfer of sovereignty had been decided by treaties and paid for with money. But the island did not feel purchased into a new identity. In the villages, people still spoke their own dialects, settled disputes by local custom, and carried memories of resistance that were only a few seasons old. France was present in uniforms and paperwork, but it was not yet present in the heart. Napoleon grew up inside that tension. He was French by document, Corsican by temperament, and fully accepted by neither. His family belonged to the minor nobility, noble enough to carry a name and expectations, poor enough to feel every humiliation of dependence. Titles existed, but they did not protect you. Pride existed, but it did not buy you bread. From early on, he learned that status without power is simply a promise the world can break. In 1779, when he was sent to the mainland for schooling, the distance widened into isolation. It was the first severing. On the other side was France. Polished accents, courtly manners, social codes that children absorbed as naturally as air. Napoleon arrived without those instincts. His French sounded wrong. His posture looked stiff. His clothes, even when clean, looked provincial. The other boys noticed immediately. Some mocked him for his accent. Others mocked him for his poverty. Many mocked him simply because he was easy to single out. At Brienne and later at the military school in Paris, he learned the social lesson that would shape him as deeply as any textbook. Belonging is not granted to outsiders. It is earned or taken. Napoleon did not respond by trying to charm his way in. He did not become the class entertainer, the smooth talker, the boy who learns the right laugh at the right time. Instead, he withdrew, not in a melodramatic way, quietly, methodically. And withdrawal, repeated often enough, becomes strategy. He began to live in his head. Books replaced friends. Maps replaced conversation. When other cadets played at war in the courtyard, he studied the mechanics of war in manuals. When they talked about family connections and future commissions, he ran numbers, memorized geography, and learned the language of artillery. Artillery suited him. It was the branch where mathematics mattered, where precision mattered, where you could change outcomes without needing to be loved. He read history with a particular hunger, not romantic stories of knights and banners, but the cold histories of states, how they rose, how they expanded, how they collapsed. He learned the anatomy of authority. He studied Romans, not for their glory, but for their administration. He studied generals not for their heroism, but for their timing. This was not escapism. It was training. Slowly, he developed a habit that would never leave him. He began to memorize France, not as a homeland, but as a system. Rivers became obstacles or arteries. Mountain passes became gates. Cities became nodes of control. Regions became variables, loyal or restless, rich or hungry, close to supply or far from it. He learned that the world can be reduced not to meaning but to function. In a stable society, a young man like this might have become a competent officer and disappeared into the long middle of life. But France was not stable. By the late 1780s, the monarchy was weakening under debt and indecision. The aristocracy clung to privilege even as it lost the ability to command. The state could no longer balance its books or its contradictions. Something was going to break. The revolution erupted. Napoleon watched it the way he watched everything else, with assessment. The revolution did not begin as his religion. It began as an environment. The old order cracked open, and suddenly positions that had been sealed by birth were exposed to talent. Officers fled. Command chains broke. Experience leaked away. The army, which should have been a single instrument, became a body missing its bones. Chaos spread through institutions the way fire spreads through dry brush. But for Napoleon, chaos did not feel like pure terror. It felt like clarity. When rules dissolve, the hidden rules appear. When hierarchy collapses, usefulness becomes visible. Napoleon proved useful quickly. He followed orders precisely. He solved logistical problems efficiently. He moved faster than commanders who were distracted by politics. When revolutionary authorities faced armed resistance, Napoleon did not argue about virtue. He calculated trajectories. Cannon fire was not ideological to him. It was functional. A problem existed. A solution existed. He applied it. In 1793, at Toulon, this mindset became unmistakable. The port city had risen against the revolution and welcomed British support. For the revolutionary government, Toulon was both a strategic threat and a symbolic wound. They needed it back, and they needed it back decisively. Napoleon, still young, saw what others missed: the geometry of the harbor, the placement of guns, the way control of a few key points could collapse an entire defense. He reorganized the artillery, hauled heavy guns into place with the patience of an engineer, and aimed not at the city itself, but at the positions that made the harbor usable. When those batteries fell silent, the foreign ships could no longer sit safely in the bay. The logic was simple and brutal. Control the harbor, and the city follows. Toulon surrendered. Napoleon was promoted. And the revolution learned for the first time what it felt like to be rescued by calculation. From that moment, people began to notice the pattern. Disorder appeared. Napoleon arrived. Order returned. He did not create stability through speeches. He created it through precision. In a country exhausted by rhetoric, this felt like relief. The revolution, meanwhile, grew more feverish. Factions turned on one another. Committees ruled by suspicion. The guillotine became a rhythm. Many men learned that the revolution did not reward sincerity. It rewarded survival. Napoleon learned something slightly different. He learned that ideology burns hot, but governance requires cold hands. He remained emotionally detached. He served the state without binding himself to its slogans: liberty, equality, fraternity, useful words, unstable foundations. Napoleon preferred numbers. He trusted logistics more than rhetoric, discipline more than enthusiasm, structure more than hope. This made him increasingly valuable. While politicians argued about what France should become, Napoleon kept it operational. Each promotion he received was justified by crisis. Each new responsibility framed as necessity. Each step upward explained as temporary. He did not seize power. It accumulated around him like water filling the lowest point. Revolutionary leaders believed they were using Napoleon. In reality, they were educating him. They showed him how fragile legitimacy could be, how quickly authority evaporates when it cannot enforce itself. They showed him that crowds can be redirected and that fear is more reliable than gratitude. Napoleon watched, learned, and filed the lessons away. As the terror subsided and the country staggered into the uneasy calm of the Directory, France did not feel victorious. It felt drained. The revolutionary dream had produced new elites, new corruption, new uncertainty. People began to crave stability more than purity. Napoleon noticed this shift with the same cold attention he had once applied to maps. He was careful, because ambition was still dangerous. The revolution devoured those who appeared too eager. So Napoleon continued to present himself as useful, calm, efficient, replaceable in theory, but in practice, increasingly difficult to remove. When leaders faltered, they called for the army. When the army required coordination, they called for Napoleon. By the time he left France for his first major foreign command, he was no longer merely an outsider trying to prove himself. He had become a necessity, and necessity, once established, has a way of demanding more. Napoleon began his life as an exile inside France, a boy mocked for how he spoke. Now he was learning a darker language, the grammar of modern power, where authority grows not by inheritance, but by appearing to be the only workable option left. Revolutions do not unfold the way their architects imagine. They are conceived in language, they are announced through declarations, they promise clarity, justice, and renewal. But they are lived through uncertainty. France did not wake up one morning unified beneath revolutionary purpose. It staggered forward unevenly, unsure who truly commanded authority, unsure which laws were binding and which were temporary improvisations, unsure whether yesterday's heroes would survive until tomorrow. Power existed everywhere, but it did not settle. Control surfaced briefly, then vanished again. Assemblies replaced councils, councils replaced kings, committees replaced assemblies, each institution claimed legitimacy. None possessed durability. The revolution spoke constantly of sovereignty, but no one could quite locate it. For Napoleon, the experience was different. He did not feel intoxicated, he felt exposed. He did not fall in love with the revolution. He examined it. The revolution did not offer him meaning. It offered him access. Old hierarchies collapsed faster than new ones could be constructed. Aristocratic officers fled abroad, resigned quietly, or were executed publicly. Entire command structures dissolved in months, sometimes weeks. The army, which should have been the disciplined instrument of the state, became a fragile organism held together by enthusiasm, improvisation, and fear. Orders were issued without clarity. Authority shifted according to political tides. Loyalty became conditional. Napoleon watched all of this carefully. He saw that ideology could ignite action, but it could not coordinate it. It could mobilize crowds, but it could not move artillery on time. Where others argued about loyalty, Napoleon searched for function. Where others demanded proof of belief, he looked for proof of capability. He did not ask which faction was morally correct. He asked which faction could act decisively under pressure. This distinction mattered. As revolutionary governments lurched from crisis to crisis, they discovered an uncomfortable truth. They still needed the army, and the army still needed officers who knew how to command. when rules were unclear and legitimacy was unstable. Napoleon proved himself not by proclamation, but by resolution. He did not demand recognition. He solved problems. He accepted assignments others avoided. He imposed discipline where structure had decayed. He restored order without ceremony. When resistance emerged, he did not negotiate principles. He calculated force. To Napoleon, artillery was not political language. It was mechanical application. A threat existed, a solution existed. He applied it. This attitude made him useful. It also made him dangerous. In revolutionary France, usefulness without visible belief attracted suspicion. Those who did not perform ideological enthusiasm loudly enough were watched. Neutrality could be mistaken for disloyalty. Silence could be interpreted as resistance. Napoleon learned this quickly. He learned to speak the language of the revolution without surrendering to it. He adopted its vocabulary when required. He praised liberty while enforcing order. He defended equality while imposing hierarchy. He understood that survival in revolutionary systems depends not on sincerity, but on timing. This was not contradiction. It was adaptation. Napoleon grasped something fundamental about revolutions that many of their participants never fully understood. Revolutions punish ambition that announces itself. They reward competence that appears reluctant. Power must seem unavoidable, not desired. He mastered this instinctively. Each promotion he received was framed as temporary. Each new command justified by emergency. Each advancement explained as service, not aspiration. To outside observers, his rise appeared accidental, a sequence of fortunate assignments, a young officer carried upward by circumstance. In reality, Napoleon was studying revolutionary power from the inside. He watched committees destroy one another over ideological purity. He watched leaders who spoke most passionately lose control fastest. He watched fear replace conviction as the dominant political currency. As the terror intensified, the population did not grow more devoted to revolutionary ideals. It grew weary. Fear does not inspire loyalty forever. Eventually, it drains it. Napoleon noticed. He noticed that enthusiasm decays faster than discipline, that slogans lose authority under scarcity, that people do not crave virtue when survival feels uncertain. They crave order. They crave predictability. They crave relief. This shift marked a turning point. As revolutionary fervor burned itself out, France entered an uneasy calm. The monarchy was gone. The old order destroyed. But nothing coherent had replaced it. The revolution had dismantled hierarchy without constructing stability. The directory that emerged was legal but weak, representative but fragmented, cautious but corrupt. It governed without confidence and ruled without conviction. Laws existed, but enforcement depended on circumstance. Authority existed, but only when backed by force. This environment suited Napoleon precisely. A weak government depends on strong instruments. A divided authority relies on enforcers who do not compete with it ideologically. Napoleon presented himself as exactly that. Not as a savior, not as a visionary. As an operator, he did not speak about what France should become. He focused on keeping it intact. When unrest flared in Paris, he restored order with speed and precision. When conspiracies threatened the government, he suppressed them decisively. There was no theatrical cruelty in his methods, No pleasure in force, only efficiency. Problems were addressed, outcomes were achieved. Each intervention reinforced the same pattern. Disorder appeared. Napoleon acted. Order returned. In reality, they were becoming dependent on him. This dependency altered the balance quietly. Reliance replaced authority. When the government feared crowds, it turned to the army. When the army required coordination, it turned to Napoleon. Each cycle deepened reliance, tightening the bond between necessity and power. Napoleon understood what this meant. Modern power does not need to announce itself. It does not require crowns or ceremonies. It emerges through necessity. Those who become indispensable are rarely removed. Those who stabilize chaos are forgiven their methods. Napoleon filed this knowledge away. He remained careful. Revolutionary France still punished visible ambition. The memory of purges was fresh. Those who moved too openly disappeared. Power had to be approached indirectly. So Napoleon allowed others to claim credit, allowed politicians to speak, allowed institutions to believe they retained control. He operated where attention was minimal, appearing only when order was required. This restraint made him appear loyal, and loyalty in unstable regimes is rewarded. Not through ideology, not through charisma, through reliability. The revolution had given him a ladder, each rung justified by crisis, each ascent framed as temporary. Napoleon understood something many revolutionaries did not. Ladders are not destinations. They exist to be climbed and then left behind. When Napoleon departed France to confront enemies abroad, he carried more than authority with him. He carried a refined understanding of modern power. He had learned that legitimacy is fragile. That belief fades. That order, once restored, creates its own justification. And once chaos becomes a tool, it stops being frightening. Power reveals itself slowly to most men. To Napoleon, it arrived as a realization. Until now, he had learned how systems collapse, how authority fragments, how necessity creates opportunity. What he had not yet learned was how belief itself could be engineered. That lesson came outside France. When Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy in 1796, the appointment did not look like a prize. It looked like a disposal. The Italian front was underfunded, undersupplied, and widely treated as secondary. The soldiers were unpaid, boots split, powder was rationed, horses were thin, morale was thinner. Senior officers had learned to lower expectations in order to survive disappointment. Napoleon arrived and refused to lower anything. He began with a cold inventory. How many men could march? How many could fire? How many could be moved quickly enough to matter? He studied the geography, not as scenery, but as a machine with levers, mountain passes that acted like gates, rivers that acted like ropes, roads that acted like arteries. He listened to briefings, dismissed excuses, and issued orders with a clarity that felt almost rude. What surprised the army first was not his ambition. It was his certainty. Napoleon spoke as if outcomes were already decided, as if victory were a matter of timing rather than chance. He promised the soldiers food and money, not as a hope, but as a consequence of movement. "We will find it," was the implication. "We will take it." In an army used to delay and shortage, the promise of immediacy sounded like magic. Then he moved. He moved faster than opponents expected, faster than allies were prepared for, faster than his own supply lines could comfortably support. Speed itself became a weapon. Traditional commanders waited for perfect alignment, more ammunition, clearer orders, better weather, the slow approval of distant ministries. Napoleon treated hesitation as a form of defeat. He attacked before enemies could concentrate. He separated their forces, struck the gap, and disappeared again. He created a rhythm that felt like inevitability. This was the moment Napoleon discovered will. Not will as emotion, not will as desire, will as momentum. He understood that armies do not merely fight battles, they inhabit stories. Soldiers fight better when they believe they are already winning. Populations submit more readily when outcomes feel inevitable. Opponents hesitate when they cannot predict your next move. Napoleon began to control not just territory, but perception. He shaped the narrative as carefully as he shaped the marching order. After victories, he issued bulletins. They were written with confidence, with a deliberate simplicity that made the war sound clean. He exaggerated success, minimized losses, and framed every movement as part of a larger design. These bulletins traveled back to France and outward across Europe. They moved faster than truth. By the time reality arrived, the story had already settled. This was not deception for its own sake. It was strategy. Napoleon understood something ancient and modern at once. Reality bends first to belief, then to force. In Italy, this approach worked repeatedly. Outnumbered columns defeated larger armies. Enemy commanders retreated not because they were destroyed, but because their assumptions had been shattered. Napoleon attacked when no one expected attack. He regrouped faster than opponents could react. He crossed rivers as if they were suggestions. He appeared at the decisive point before the decisive point seemed to exist. Victories accumulated. And with each victory, Napoleon's confidence hardened into something more dangerous. He began to trust his own judgment over structure, over tradition, over caution. The army noticed. The officers who had once doubted him began to obey him with a kind of relieved surrender. Soldiers followed him not because they understood his plans, but because they trusted his momentum. He rode tirelessly. He spoke directly. He rewarded competence quickly and punished failure without hesitation. Napoleon was no longer simply commanding an army. He was shaping its psychology. Before Italy, he believed in systems. After Italy, he believed in himself. Not because he became sentimental, but because he saw what systems could not do. Institutions were slow. Committees debated. Ministries hesitated. But a single mind could move. A single decision made early enough could create a reality that later decisions were forced to accept. Power, he realized, belongs to those who move first and explain later. This lesson followed him to Egypt. On paper, Egypt looked like genius. Strike at British interests, open new routes, project French influence beyond Europe. In practice, it became a campaign of distance, disease, and misunderstanding. The fleet was trapped. The desert did not care about French ambition. Militarily, the expedition overextended what France could sustain, but psychologically, Egypt taught Napoleon something crucial. It taught him that force has limits, and that myth does not. Napoleon brought scholars, artists, and scientists with him. He staged the campaign as a performance of civilization. He spoke as if France had come not merely to conquer, but to enlighten. He allowed rumors to grow around him. He adopted symbols that made him seem larger than the role of general. When he stood before ancient stone, He let the silence do some of the work. He understood that antiquity can lend authority to those who know how to borrow it. When military reality faltered, narrative filled the gap. Even failure could be converted into meaning. Even retreat could be reframed as perspective. Napoleon returned to France, leaving his army behind. It was a morally ambiguous choice, but it was also a diagnostic one. He had learned that the center of power was not where bullets flew. It was where legitimacy was negotiated. He understood that France's government was weaker than France's appetite for stability, and that his own name had become a kind of currency. Back in Paris, France had continued to drift. The Directory was legal but hollow. Corruption was open. Elections were managed, public trust eroded. The revolution had not ended, but it had grown tired. It produced slogans without confidence and laws without obedience. Napoleon did not return as a petitioner. He returned as a solution. Politicians sought his support. Factions courted his neutrality. Newspapers praised him. Crowds leaned toward him without quite knowing why. His presence altered calculations. He did not need to argue for authority. Authority gathered around him. This was the final transformation. Napoleon understood now that power does not require legitimacy first. Legitimacy follows effectiveness. He no longer waited for crises to summon him. He positioned himself near them. When the coup came, it was not dramatic in the way revolutions are dramatic. There were no stormed palaces, no ecstatic crowds, no spontaneous purity. The machinery of government simply shifted. Meetings were convened. Guards were placed. Papers were signed. Confusion was contained. Resistance was isolated. The Republic was preserved in name. The revolution defended in language, and control relocated quietly. Napoleon stepped into the space the system left behind. He did not overthrow the state. He reprogrammed it. Modern power, he realized, is installed through calm. It speaks in neutral terms. It presents itself as an administrative necessity. It claims to protect the very thing it replaces. It does not declare a new order. It arranges the old order until the old order cannot recognize itself. By the end of this phase, Napoleon was no longer climbing ladders. He was rearranging the building. Institutions bent around him. Laws adjusted. Authority consolidated without appearing to. It was not yet tyranny in the old language. It was preparation in the new language. Napoleon had learned how to move faster than resistance, how to speak in rational terms, while concentrating force, how to turn success into inevitability. He had learned how to make power feel reasonable, and that is when power becomes most difficult to resist. Napoleon had discovered will, not as ambition, but as control over momentum itself. The next step was inevitable and far more dangerous. Revolutions promise endings. They promise the end of tyranny, the end of inherited power, the end of arbitrary rule. What they rarely explain is what happens when the old language of authority collapses, but no new language has fully taken its place. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte returned to Paris at the end of the 18th century, the French Revolution had already outlived its illusions. The monarchy was gone. The aristocracy was broken. The divine logic that once justified rule had been publicly discredited. But the revolutionary logic that replaced it had begun to fray. France was no longer arguing about ideals, it was negotiating exhaustion. The revolution had survived its enemies, but it had not solved its own contradictions. Power still needed to be exercised. Decisions still needed to be enforced. Order still needed to be maintained. And the revolutionary state had never quite answered who was meant to do that or how. The Directory governed through legality, but not authority. Elections were held, but outcomes were adjusted. Laws were written, but enforcement depended on circumstance. Corruption was visible and tolerated. Decide what remains, what is repaired, and what is quietly replaced. Napoleon did not argue for a new ideology. He offered management. The coup of 1799 did not arrive with the emotional violence of earlier revolutionary moments. There were no ecstatic crowds storming palaces, no public executions to signal moral renewal. Instead, there were councils, procedural maneuvers, carefully positioned troops, and legal justifications prepared in advance. Confusion replaced outrage. Napoleon understood something his contemporaries did not. Modern power does not announce itself through spectacle. It installs itself through administration. It speaks in neutral language. It claims continuity even as it relocates control. The Republic survived in name. The Revolution survived in rhetoric. But authority moved. Napoleon did not abolish institutions. He reorganized them. The consulate that emerged narrowed decision-making without declaring dictatorship. Debate shortened. Execution accelerated. Power became legible again. Orders flowed in one direction. Responsibility concentrated. The constant improvisation of revolutionary governance gave way to predictable procedure. For a population drained by instability, this felt like relief. Napoleon framed his authority carefully. He did not claim divine right. He did not resurrect the old monarchy. He presented himself as the guardian of revolutionary gains. Equality before the law would be preserved. Property would be protected. Order would be restored without returning privilege to the aristocracy. This framing mattered. Napoleon positioned himself not as the enemy of the revolution, but as its resolution. On paper, it looked like Enlightenment ideals finally made permanent. But every legal system requires enforcement. The same code that promised equality centralized authority. The same clarity that stabilized justice expanded the reach of the state. Administration replaced tradition. Obedience replaced participation. Justice became predictable, but also impersonal. This was not an accident. Napoleon believed deeply in rational organization. He believed human affairs could be arranged like mathematics if sentiment were removed. Complexity could be simplified. Chaos could be disciplined. Freedom could be administered. This belief did not contradict the Enlightenment. It completed its most dangerous possibility. As Napoleon consolidated control, resistance softened rather than intensified. He restored the Catholic Church, but subordinated it to the state. He preserved revolutionary reforms, but restricted revolutionary behavior. He rewarded loyalty over passion. He valued competence above belief. France stabilized, and stability carries a quiet seduction. Economic life resumed. Roads were repaired. Education reorganized. Taxation regularized. For many citizens, daily life became predictable again. The constant anxiety of revolutionary uncertainty receded. In exchange, political participation narrowed. Napoleon understood the trade instinctively. Order, once delivered, becomes its own justification. Napoleon also understood that stability is not only built through laws, it is built through visibility. He created prefects to extend Paris into every department, turning the state into something that could be felt in daily life. He reorganized education so that the next generation would learn the same definitions of loyalty and order. He rewarded service through honors and titles that looked old but functioned like incentives. A new nobility emerged, not from blood but from usefulness. At the same time, the revolution's noisy public sphere began to narrow. Newspapers were reduced, supervised, and pressured into agreement. Dissent was treated not as debate, but as disturbance. Police networks expanded quietly. Napoleon did not need constant terror. He preferred constant administration. Control became routine rather than dramatic, which made it easier to accept. When he moved toward empire, he did so cautiously. Titles returned but stripped of lineage. Honors were granted but tied to service. Power was centralized but described as efficiency rather than domination. Then, in 1804, the transformation became explicit. Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Every gesture deliberate. The Pope was present, but secondary. When the moment arrived, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. That single act contained the entire philosophy of his rule. Authority no longer descended from God. It no longer rose from the people. It emerged from capability. Napoleon did not reject religion. He subordinated it. He did not abolish tradition. He repurposed it. The crown did not symbolize inheritance. It symbolized function. Napoleon was not declaring himself chosen. He was declaring himself necessary. Across Europe, unease spread. Even the way he sought approval reflected this new logic. He used plebiscites and votes not to invite uncertainty, but to manufacture consent. The question was always framed so that agreement sounded like reason. Opposition was not argued with. It was isolated, managed, and made to seem small. The empire also became personal. Napoleon placed relatives on thrones, not because Europe respected family, but because systems require trusted nodes. If the continent was being redesigned, it needed dependable hands at key points. It was infrastructure. The revolution had promised to abolish monarchy. Instead, it had produced a new kind of monarch, one who ruled without ancestry, without divine sanction, without claiming permanence. His authority rested on administration, efficiency, and success. This was something new. Napoleon did not rule as a king among kings. He ruled as a system among systems. Where his armies went, administration followed. Borders were redrawn, states consolidated, laws standardized, privileges stripped away, local autonomy dissolved. Resistance was reframed as disorder. Conquest was not merely territorial. It was structural. Napoleon exported modern power, and in doing so, he revealed its cost. Efficiency justified domination. What could not be rationalized was removed. Napoleon did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a corrector. Europe, in his view, was irrational, fragmented, corrupted by tradition. He would impose coherence. He would finish what philosophers had begun, He would force history to align with reason. This conviction made him unstoppable. It also made him blind. The more Napoleon succeeded, the more he trusted systems over limits, the more he trusted himself over caution. Administration expanded, armies grew, control extended farther from the center, and systems do not fail loudly at first. They strain. Napoleon's empire appeared stable. It felt inevitable. It seemed permanent. But permanence in modern power is an illusion sustained by momentum. By crowning himself, Napoleon did not betray the revolution. He revealed its endpoint. He showed that rational systems, once centralized, naturally seek a single will. That equality before the law does not prevent hierarchy. That order, when valued above all else, demands obedience. The Enlightenment had not abolished kings. It had redesigned them. Napoleon stood at the center of that redesign. He was no longer reorganizing institutions. He was holding the entire structure together. And structures held together by a single will carry enormous weight. They also collapse catastrophically when that will is stretched too far. The question was no longer whether Napoleon could rule, it was whether the system he embodied could survive its own ambition. That question would be answered far from Paris. Not in ceremony, not in philosophy, but in distance, in scale, in silence. Power rarely collapses where it is strongest. It collapses where it is stretched. For years, Napoleon's empire had expanded the way a well-built machine expands, smoothly, predictably, almost impersonally. Borders moved, laws followed. Administrations arrived behind the armies like a second wave of certainty. From Paris, Europe looked reorganized, not merely conquered, but arranged. From a distance, it looked inevitable. That was the danger. Napoleon had learned to trust systems because systems had rewarded him. Efficiency had become his proof. Every campaign that ended in order reinforced the same belief that history could be managed, that resistance could be corrected, that the continent could be standardized like a legal code. Russia tested that belief. The conflict did not begin with a single insult or a single outrage. It began the way modern conflicts often begin, with misalignment, trade restrictions, diplomatic pressure, a refusal to cooperate fully with the continental system that Napoleon expected to bind Europe together. Russia did not challenge his legitimacy in speeches. It simply refused to behave as his system required. For Napoleon, that refusal was more destabilizing than open rebellion. His empire depended on coherence. It depended on predictable compliance, on borders that meant something, on rules that could be enforced without constant improvisation. A single major power drifting out of alignment created stress everywhere. Smuggling increased. Alliances weakened. Smaller states began to wonder whether obedience was still the safest option. And once that question appears, it spreads. Napoleon did not frame the coming campaign as conquest. He framed it as enforcement, a corrective operation, a demonstration that the system still held. The plan, in his mind, was simple: move east, apply pressure, force engagement, restore obedience, then withdraw with the continent once again aligned. On paper, it was rational. And Napoleon trusted paper. The Grand Army assembled with unprecedented scale. It was not just French, it was European. Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, and others marched under a single command structure. The number itself felt like assurance. If the empire was a system, this was its proof of capacity. Hundreds of thousands of men moving as one instrument, fueled by the confidence that size could substitute for uncertainty. Scale had worked before, but scale carries costs that do not appear in proclamations. The farther the army marched, the longer its supply lines stretched. Roads broke beneath constant wheels, wagons splintered, horses weakened, food spoiled or vanished. Coordination slowed in small, almost invisible ways. Orders took longer to arrive. Information arrived later, dirtier, less reliable. The machine that functioned so cleanly in Europe began to grind. Russia did not offer the kind of war Napoleon preferred. It did not present a single decisive battle early enough to justify the campaign. It did not defend every town. It did not stand still and accept the terms of Napoleon's timing. It offered distance. Villages were abandoned. Crops were destroyed. Wells were poisoned. The land retreated as the army advanced, as if geography itself were refusing to cooperate. There was nothing to seize that would stabilize the march. There was no administrative prize that could be turned into a functioning node of control, only movement without reward. Napoleon continued forward. This was his mistake, and it did not feel like a mistake at the time. Momentum had saved him before. Speed had been his weapon. Pressure had forced opponents into errors. He believed that the same logic would apply here: move fast enough, and the enemy must eventually turn to fight. Instead, the campaign exposed the limits of his method. The very concept of decisive point began to dissolve. Napoleon's system was designed to compress space through speed. Russia expanded space through refusal. There was no single moment of failure. That is what made it catastrophic. Soldiers did not collapse all at once. They thinned, gradually, from hunger, then exhaustion, then disease. Discipline eroded not through rebellion but through depletion. Units shrank without drama. Men fell behind, not out of cowardice, but because bodies cannot be ordered to function forever. Commands still existed, but compliance became slower, then imperfect, then absent. Napoleon reached Moscow to find a city that did not behave like a capital. It was empty. No delegation, no surrender, no system waiting to be reorganized. And then it burned. The fire mattered not only because it destroyed shelter. It destroyed meaning. Napoleon had marched expecting a political conclusion, a treaty, a submission, a re-entry of Russia into the continental order. Instead, he found ash, a city without an audience, a conquest without compliance. This was not a traditional defeat. No decisive battle had crushed him, but the campaign had failed to produce the outcome his system required. Napoleon had nowhere to install his order. There was nothing to stabilize, only ruin. Winter arrived without negotiation. Temperatures dropped, horses died, cannons were abandoned, men wrapped themselves in whatever they could take from the ruins. Command remained, but control did not. The machinery that worked so perfectly in the well-serviced roads of Europe could not survive this environment. Order dissolved, not with a shout, but with silence. Retreat began not as a choice, but as a necessity. And retreat revealed what advance had hidden. The army turned back along the same paths it had stripped bare. Food was gone. Shelter was gone. What remained was exposure. Men froze where they stood. Others collapsed from starvation. Lines broke into clusters, then into fragments, then into individual survivors. The Grand Army, once a single instrument, became a moving field of exhaustion. Napoleon remained composed. This is important. He did not panic in public. He did not allow the myth to crack openly. He continued to issue orders as if the structure still existed, as if discipline alone could overcome scale, climate, and distance. But discipline cannot create food. Orders cannot shorten winter. Systems cannot operate without material. By the time the remnants crossed back into Europe, the illusion of inevitability had evaporated. The empire still existed, but it no longer felt permanent. News traveled faster than troops. Allies recalculated. Subjugated states hesitated. Resistance resurfaced in places that had been quiet. Coalitions reformed with a confidence they had not possessed before. The myth of unstoppable order was broken, and myth, once broken, cannot be repaired by explanation. Napoleon understood this immediately. He moved to rebuild. He raised new armies with astonishing speed, drawing again on the administrative capacity he had built. New conscripts arrived. New officers were promoted. New supplies were requisitioned. The machine still functioned, which proved how powerful it was. But now it required constant effort to keep it running. This was the turning point. Before Russia, Napoleon expanded systems. After Russia, he defended them. Each campaign that followed became more desperate, each victory more expensive. The empire no longer grew smoothly. It strained. Enemies learned to avoid the decisive confrontation Napoleon wanted. They stretched conflict, retreated strategically, attacked supply lines, and forced his system to operate beyond its comfortable range. They used distance the way Russia had used distance. Napoleon still won battles. But battles no longer decided the war. The state began to harden. Administration became more rigid. Flexibility vanished. Decisions centralized further as trust eroded. Napoleon relied increasingly on personal judgment, personal presence, personal authority. The system that had once reduced his dependence on charisma now demanded his attention everywhere. This was the final contradiction. He had built an empire designed to function without sentiment. But once overstretched, it required more of him than any system can reasonably provide. He was everywhere and nowhere enough. The machine began to outgrow its operator. Defeats accumulated without spectacle. Not dramatic collapses, but incremental losses. Allies defected, control narrowed, the edges frayed first, then the center began to feel pressure. Eventually, Paris fell, not through uprising, not through revolution, through exhaustion. Napoleon abdicated because he could no longer stabilize the structure he embodied. The logic that had elevated him now turned against him. If he was necessary for order, then his failure meant he was no longer necessary. Modern power is ruthless in this way. It does not punish intentions. It replaces what stops functioning. Exile followed. At first, it was almost gentle, a small island, limited authority, a ruler reduced to a symbol without a system. Even then, the logic of his presence remained dangerous. A system that has reorganized itself around one man can attempt to do it again. He escaped, returned. For a brief moment, the machinery reassembled around him. The 100 days felt like resurrection, but it was a thinner version of the past, a structure rebuilt from memory rather than confidence. The conditions that had once made him inevitable were gone. Europe had learned to coordinate. France had learned to hesitate. The myth could not be restored to full power. The final defeat did not arrive as surprise. It arrived as confirmation. When Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, it was not simply punishment. It was containment. It was the recognition that the system he represented could reorganize itself again if he remained close enough to be useful. On that remote island, Napoleon remained alive, watched, recorded, and neutralized. Power without movement, authority without function, a mind designed to manage systems trapped without one. This is the quiet lesson of Russia and what followed. Modern power does not always die in a single battle. It is dismantled by scale, distance, and limits. It refuses to acknowledge. Napoleon believed that order, once perfected, could expand endlessly. Russia proved otherwise. It showed that systems, no matter how rational, are bound by material reality, that the world cannot be compressed forever. That momentum cannot replace meaning. The empire collapsed not because Napoleon lacked will, but because will cannot compress the world. Power ends quietly, not with speeches, not with crowds, not even with defeat. It ends when it can no longer move. When Napoleon arrived at St. Helena, the island was not designed to punish him emotionally. It was designed to neutralize him functionally. Remote, isolated, surrounded by water and surveillance, it was chosen not for cruelty, but for reliability. This was not a prison built from anger. It was a container built from calculation. Napoleon was no longer dangerous because he commanded armies. He was dangerous because systems remembered him. His era had not ended cleanly. The administrative logic he had spread still operated. The states that replaced him still borrowed his methods. The men who defeated him still governed through centralized authority, organized taxation, standardized law, and disciplined bureaucracy. As long as Napoleon remained within reach of Europe, he represented a possibility, a center around which disorder might reorganize itself. St. Helena removed that possibility. The island was small, the horizon was short, the weather was damp, restless, and indifferent. Movement was constrained by geography and by permission. Napoleon, who had mastered scale and distance, was reduced to routine. Walks on limited paths, meals at fixed hours, conversations that repeated, days measured not by decisions but by repetition. For a man whose power had depended on motion, this was the most complete defeat imaginable. At first he resisted it, the only way he knew. He applied pressure. He argued with his keepers. He complained about conditions. He demanded recognition of rank. These gestures were not simply pride. They were instinct. Napoleon had spent his life testing boundaries, pressing systems until they revealed flexibility. In France, institutions bent. In Italy, armies shifted. In Europe, monarchies rearranged. His entire method relied on the assumption that reality responds to force. St. Helena did not respond. Orders were not negotiated. Appeals were recorded and ignored. The schedule remained. This was new. Napoleon had rarely encountered a structure that did not yield to pressure, at least in some small way. Here, the system was designed to be boring. Boredom was part of its strength. Nothing dramatic happened because drama creates openings. The island offered no openings. It offered only time. Time was his enemy. Removed from command, Napoleon turned inward. He dictated memoirs. He reconstructed his life through narrative. He reframed defeats, he justified decisions, he sharpened the logic of his choices until even failure could be made to sound like necessity. This was not deception for its own sake. It was self-preservation. Napoleon understood something essential about legacy. History does not remember systems. It remembers stories. Systems dissolve into paperwork and habit, but stories survive because they can be repeated. If he could no longer control events, he would attempt to control interpretation. He would become the author of himself. So he spoke endlessly about campaigns, about betrayals, about timing, about enemies who refused the kind of war he preferred. He cast himself as a figure constrained by forces larger than any single mind could overcome: distance, weather, coalition, material limits. He did not deny mistakes, but he redistributed responsibility. He did not call himself innocent. He called himself inevitable. Whites! This was consistent with how he had always ruled. Napoleon never believed power was personal in a sentimental sense. He believed it was structural. That belief had elevated him. Now it turned against him. If systems were everything, then his removal was simply another structural correction. If order justified authority, then losing order justified replacement. Modern power is ruthless in this way. It does not punish intentions. It replaces what stops functioning. St. Helena did not hate Napoleon. It processed him. The daily details mattered because they were the new battlefield. The quality of the house, the freedom to ride, the ability to receive visitors, the respect of guards. Napoleon argued over these not because they were important in themselves, but because they were the only remaining levers. When your world shrinks, even small controls become precious. He learned the humiliating mathematics of confinement, how a life can be reduced. At times he performed dignity, as if posture could restore scale. At times he performed injury, as if injustice could generate sympathy. At times he performed indifference, as if not caring could be a form of dominance. These were not contradictions. They were strategies applied to a new environment. But the environment did not change. As months became years, his health declined. The body that had carried him across continents began to fail. Illness crept in slowly, without drama. There was no battlefield wound to mythologize, no final charge to narrate. Pain arrived like weather, persistent, repetitive, unresponsive to will. Napoleon endured this with the same cold attention he once gave logistics. He observed symptoms, he measured decline, he argued with doctors, he suspected plots, he recorded details. He could not accept a failure that could not be outmaneuvered. On St. Helena, he was forced to confront something he had avoided for most of his life: irrelevance, not erasure, not obscurity, but non-participation. The world continued without consulting him. Decisions were made elsewhere. Borders shifted. Alliances formed. Wars were prepared without his presence. He became an observer of systems he had helped shape, unable to intervene. For a man whose identity was fused with effectiveness, this was intolerable. Napoleon had not ruled through charm alone. He ruled because things moved when he acted. He made decisions, and reality rearranged itself around them. Exile removed the possibility of rearrangement. Without it, identity thinned. So he returned again and again to the past. He spoke about Corsica, the accent, the humiliation, the early loneliness. He traced patterns backward, searching for origins: outsiderhood, observation, discipline, control. He framed his life as a logical sequence rather than a moral one. He did not ask whether he had been good. He asked whether he had been coherent. Napoleon did not measure himself by goodness. He measured himself by structure. From that perspective, his life still made sense. A world collapsing under contradictions, a man imposing order, a system expanding beyond its capacity. Administration could outgrow symbolism. Efficiency could quiet human longing. He had treated emotion as noise and organization as truth. St. Helena proved that humans do not live by organization alone. Stories circulated, portraits multiplied, songs were written, children learned his name long after his authority vanished. The figure grew larger as the man diminished. Removed from power, he became narrative. The same distance that neutralized his capacity to act enlarged his capacity to be interpreted. This was the final paradox. Napoleon had ruled by dismantling myth. He was remembered as one. He had crowned himself as necessity, and history crowned him as symbol. People argued about him, the way they argue about forces of nature. Was he genius or monster? Liberator or tyrant? Revolutionary or emperor? The contradictions preserved him. A simple villain is forgotten. A complicated figure becomes permanent. St. Helena completed that permanence. Exile also revealed something else, that the restoration of old monarchies was not a true return. Kings sat again on thrones, but the world beneath them had changed. Centralized administration remained. Merit-based promotion persisted. Codified law endured. The modern state had been normalized. Even Napoleon's enemies governed more efficiently because Napoleon had made efficiency the standard. They removed the man, not the method. Napoleon recognized this with a bitter kind of satisfaction. He had failed as an emperor, but he had succeeded as a template. The modern state no longer needed divine right. It justified itself through function. It claimed legitimacy through stability. It governed through procedures that felt neutral, even when they enforced hierarchy. This was his true legacy. And it is why his story continues to feel modern. Napoleon did not simply conquer Europe. He demonstrated how modern power can appear reasonable while becoming absolute. How bureaucracy can feel like fairness while concentrating control. How order can be offered as medicine until dependence forms. On St. Helena, strict of armies and decrees, he remained what he had always been beneath the machinery, a mind shaped by control, convinced that disorder must be corrected, convinced that history could be arranged. In the end, history arranged him, not with vengeance, not with spectacle, with distance. Napoleon died far from France, far from Europe, far from the systems he had shaped. His death did not shock the continent. The continent had already adjusted. Systems do that. They mourn briefly, then resume. But the story did not end. His name remained attached to codes, reforms, campaigns, and contradictions. His rise became a parable about talent and opportunity. His fall became a parable about overreach. His exile became a parable about what happens when a system builder loses the system. And beneath all of it, a quieter lesson lingered. Modern power does not always collapse in a single dramatic moment. It erodes when it exceeds its material limits. It breaks when it demands coherence from a world too large to compress. Napoleon did not fall because he lacked will. He fell because will cannot compress the world indefinitely. St. Helena stands as the proof. A man who once commanded continents reduced to watching the sea. A ruler who installed order through inevitability, rendered irrelevant by time. A system builder contained by a system designed to require nothing from him except stillness. This is how modern power ends. Not with a crown falling, but with nothing left to organize. Napoleon's life is often told as a rise and fall, a brilliant ascent, a dramatic collapse, a warning about ambition. That framing is comforting and incomplete. Before him, power justified itself through God, bloodlines, or tradition. Authority descended from above or inherited from the past. Napoleon replaced that logic with something colder and more durable. He showed that power could justify itself through function. If things worked, authority was acceptable. If order was restored, legitimacy followed. If stability returned, obedience felt reasonable. This was his true innovation. Napoleon did not invent modern bureaucracy, centralized administration, or merit-based hierarchy. But he proved that they could rule without myth and then paradoxically create myth afterward. He ruled first by effectiveness. He was remembered later by symbolism. That sequence matters. Napoleon's rise was not fueled by ideology. He did not conquer Europe to spread liberty, nor did he govern France to fulfill philosophical ideals. He governed to correct disorder. He conquered to enforce coherence. His belief was not moral. It was structural. The world to him was a system in need of alignment, and systems reward those who can simplify them. But systems also punish those who forget their limits. Napoleon's collapse was not the result of cruelty alone, nor arrogance alone, nor even ambition alone. It came from the belief that coherence could expand endlessly. That order, once perfected, could be applied universally. That distance, culture, climate, and scale were merely technical problems. Russia disproved that belief. Exile finalized the lesson. What remained after Napoleon was not his empire. It was his method. Modern states still govern through centralized administration, through standardized law, through merit framed as neutrality, through efficiency presented as fairness. Leaders still justify authority by pointing to outcomes rather than origins. If it works, it must be right. That logic did not die on St. Helena. It spread. This is why Napoleon continues to feel unsettlingly modern. Not because he was a conqueror, but because he ruled the way modern institutions rule, quietly, procedurally, with language that sounds reasonable even when power concentrates. He did not shout tyranny. He normalized it, and yet his story is not a simple condemnation. Napoleon revealed both the strength and the danger of modern power. He showed that order can liberate societies from chaos. He also showed that order, when stretched beyond context, becomes brittle. Systems that promise neutrality eventually demand obedience. Efficiency, once absolute, leaves no room for dissent. Napoleon's exile was not just punishment. It was containment. The world learned that systems organized around a single will are powerful but unstable, that even the most rational structures collapse when they forget the limits of reality, that no amount of discipline can compress geography, climate, or human complexity forever. In the end, Napoleon did not fail because he misunderstood power. He failed because he understood it too well. He saw how systems could replace belief. He saw how order could manufacture legitimacy. He saw how inevitability could silence resistance. What he underestimated was the cost of sustaining that inevitability. Napoleon's life leaves us with a question that still matters. But whether efficiency, when worshipped, becomes indistinguishable from domination. He did not die as a tyrant overthrown by the people. He did not die as a hero redeemed by sacrifice. He died as a system builder removed from his system. And that may be the most modern ending imaginable. Power no longer needs crowns. It needs procedures. Napoleon showed us how that world begins,